There's a particular cruelty in being forced to touch someone everyone else refuses to look at. Elena discovered this truth on a cold November evening when the charity gala's master of ceremonies announced the mandatory dance rotation, and her name was paired with his. The Scarred Man. That's what they called him, always in whispers, always with a mixture of pity and revulsion. No one knew his real name. No one cared to ask. They only knew he attended every high society function wearing an ornate silver mask that covered the right half of his face, and that beneath it lay something terrible. Something that justified the way people's eyes slid past him, the way conversations died when he approached, the way even the most desperate socialites found excuses to avoid him. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from, and if you feel it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. Your support makes all the difference. The grand ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel glittered with 1,000 points of light. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen waterfalls, casting prismatic rainbows across marble floors, polished to mirror brightness. Women in gowns that cost more than most people's yearly salaries glided across the space, their jewelry catching the light, their laughter high and performative. Men in tailored tuxedos clustered in groups, discussing business deals and political maneuvering, their champagne glasses never empty, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. It was the kind of event Elena had learned to navigate with practiced grace, the kind where every conversation was a transaction, every smile a calculation, every moment an opportunity to be seen by the right people. But tonight, all her careful social maneuvering meant nothing. Because tonight, the gala organizers had implemented a new tradition, a mandatory dance rotation designed to force mingling across social circles, to break down the invisible walls that separated the old money from the new, the powerful from the aspiring. Each guest had drawn a number upon arrival. Elena's was 17. And when the master of ceremonies called for the first rotation, when he announced that number 17 would dance with number 42, Elena felt every eye in the room turn to her, because everyone knew who number 42 was. He stood alone near the far wall, as he always did, a solitary figure in an impeccably tailored black suit that probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a bearing that suggested military training, or perhaps just the kind of rigid self-control that came from years of being stared at. His left side was perfectly normal, classically handsome even, with a strong jawline and dark hair swept back from his forehead. But the right side was hidden behind that silver mask, an ornate thing that covered from his temple to his jaw, decorated with intricate scrollwork that somehow made it more disturbing, as if beauty and horror were locked in eternal combat on his face. Elena felt her stomach tighten. Around her, she heard the whispers, felt the mixture of sympathy and schadenfreude radiating from the other guests. Poor Elena. How awful. I heard he was in a fire. No, a car accident. No, a war injury. I heard the scars are so bad he can't even eat in public. I heard he's completely disfigured. I heard one woman fainted when she saw beneath the mask. The whispers crawled over her skin like insects. She wanted to run, wanted to claim sudden illness, wanted to do anything but cross that vast expanse of marble floor to where he stood waiting. But she'd been raised better than that. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, cold and cutting as always. A lady never shows discomfort. A lady maintains composure. A lady does her duty. So Elena straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked toward him. Her gown whispered against the floor, a deep emerald silk that brought out the green in her hazel eyes. She'd chosen it carefully, knowing she'd be photographed, knowing every detail would be scrutinized by the society pages tomorrow. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant chignon, her makeup flawless, her diamond earrings borrowed from her mother's collection. She looked the part of a society princess, which is exactly what she was supposed to be, what she'd been trained to be since birth. But as she crossed that floor, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her back, she felt like a sacrifice being led to an altar. He watched her approach. She could feel his gaze, though she couldn't see his eyes clearly from this distance. He didn't move, didn't shift, didn't give any indication that her obvious reluctance affected him. He simply stood there, waiting, as still as a statue, as if he'd become accustomed to being something people had to endure rather than choose. When she finally reached him, Elena realized her hands were trembling. She clasped them together, hoping he wouldn't notice. Up close, he was even more imposing. Not just tall, but powerfully built, with a presence that filled the space around him. The mask gleamed under the chandelier light, cold and impersonal. His visible eye was dark, almost black, and completely unreadable. "I'm Elena," she said, and hated how her voice wavered slightly. He inclined his head, a gesture that was oddly formal, almost old-fashioned. "I know," he replied. His voice was deep, slightly rough, as if he didn't use it often. "Shall we?" He extended his hand, and Elena noticed it was gloved. Black leather, expensive, perfectly fitted. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of him even through the glove, and he led her to the dance floor. The orchestra began to play, a waltz, traditional and elegant. His hand settled on her waist, proper and distant, and they began to move. He was an exceptional dancer. That surprised her. She'd expected awkwardness, stiffness, the fumbling of someone who spent his life being avoided. Instead, he guided her with absolute confidence, his steps precise, his leading firm, but not controlling. They glided across the floor, and Elena found herself following instinctively, her body responding to his cues before her mind registered them. It should have been uncomfortable. It should have been awful. But instead, it was almost nice. "You don't have to look so terrified," he said quietly, his voice pitched only for her ears. "I'm not contagious." Elena felt heat flood her cheeks. "I'm not terrified," she lied. "You're a terrible liar," he observed, and there was something in his tone, not quite amusement, but close. "Your hands are shaking." Elena forced herself to meet his eye, the one visible eye that watched her with such unsettling intensity. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I'm not usually this rude." "You're not being rude," he replied. "You're being honest. Most people can't even manage to look at me. The fact that you're trying puts you ahead of 90% of this room." They continued to dance, moving through the other couples who gave them a wide berth, as if whatever misfortune had befallen him might be catching. Elena became acutely aware of how quiet it was around them, how conversations paused as they passed, how eyes followed their progress across the floor. "Why do you come to these events?" she asked before she could stop herself. "If people treat you this way, why subject yourself to it?" He was silent for a long moment, and Elena thought she'd offended him. But then he spoke, his voice carrying a weight that suggested he'd asked himself the same question many times. "Because hiding would be letting them win. Because if I stay away, I'm agreeing with their assessment that I don't belong in civilized society. Because some wounds are visible, Miss Elena, and some are not, and I refuse to pretend mine don't exist." His words struck something deep inside her, something she couldn't quite name. She found herself looking at him differently, not at the mask, but at the man beneath it, at the set of his jaw, visible on his left side, strong and determined. At the way he held himself, proud despite everything. At the careful control in every movement, as if he'd learned to take up as little space as possible while still refusing to disappear entirely. "That's brave," she said softly. "That's exhausting," he corrected. The waltz was coming to an end. Elena realized with surprise that she didn't want it to. Despite her initial horror, despite the uncomfortable attention, there was something about dancing with him that felt real in a way nothing else at these events ever did. Everyone else performed, playing roles, wearing social masks, more elaborate than his silver one. But he couldn't perform. He could only be exactly what he was. "What happened?" she asked as the final notes hung in the air. "If you don't mind my asking." He released her, stepping back with that same formal inclination of his head. "The same thing that happens to everyone, Miss Elena. Life." And then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd that parted before him like water around a stone, leaving Elena standing alone in the middle of the dance floor, feeling strangely bereft. She didn't see him for the rest of the evening. The dance rotation continued, and she was passed from partner to partner, each one safer, more appropriate, more forgettable than the last. She smiled, made small talk, played her role perfectly. But her mind kept drifting back to those few minutes, to the feel of his hand on her waist, to the unexpected grace of his movements, to the raw honesty in his voice, when he'd spoken about wounds, both visible and invisible. That night, lying in bed in her childhood room in her parents' mansion, Elena stared at the ceiling and wondered about him. Who was he really? What had happened to him? Why did he choose to wear the mask in public rather than simply avoiding society altogether? And why, despite everything, had dancing with him felt more genuine than any other interaction she'd had in months? She didn't expect to see him again. The social season was full of events, but he was a ghost at most of them. Present but invisible, acknowledged but ignored. Yet 2 weeks later, at a museum gala celebrating a new Renaissance art exhibit, Elena found herself scanning the crowd, searching for a flash of silver among the sea of faces. She told herself she was just curious, that it meant nothing, that she simply wanted to understand the mystery of the scarred man. But when she finally spotted him, standing alone in front of a massive Caravaggio painting, something in her chest loosened, and she had to admit it was more than curiosity. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his attention entirely focused on the painting. It was a depiction of St. Thomas, the doubting apostle, reaching out to touch Christ's wounds. The contrast between light and shadow was dramatic, Caravaggio's signature style, and the expression on Thomas's face was one of awe and horror and understanding all at once. Elena approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. When she stood beside him, close enough that he must have noticed her presence, he didn't turn, didn't acknowledge her. He simply continued studying the painting. "Do you know the story?" he asked after a moment, his voice quiet in the hushed gallery. Thomas wouldn't believe Christ had risen unless he could touch the wounds, unless he could see the proof of suffering. "I know it," Elena replied. "My mother dragged me to enough Sunday services." "Everyone focuses on the doubt," he continued, "but I think they miss the point. Thomas didn't need proof of divinity. He needed proof that something beautiful could survive being broken." Elena looked at the painting with new eyes, at the way Thomas's finger pressed into the wound, at the way Christ allowed it, at the strange intimacy of the moment. "Is that why you come to these galleries?" she asked. "To look at broken, beautiful things?" He finally turned to face her, and she saw something flicker in his visible eye, surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "I didn't think you'd speak to me again," he said. "After the gala." after you fulfilled your obligation." It wasn't an obligation, Elena said, and realized as she said it that it was true. Well, it was, but it didn't feel like one, not by the end. He studied her for a long moment, and Elena had the uncomfortable feeling that he saw more than she wanted him to, that somehow, despite the mask he wore, he could see past whatever mask she presented to the world. "Would you like to see my favorite piece?" he asked. "It's in the next gallery." Elena should have declined. She should have made polite excuses and returned to the main event, to the champagne and the networking and the careful social dance she knew so well. But instead, she nodded. He led her through a doorway into a smaller, quieter room. This gallery held later works, more modern pieces, and fewer people. He stopped in front of a portrait by John Singer Sargent, a woman in a black dress against a dark background, her face pale and luminous, her expression both defiant and vulnerable. "Madame X," he said, "do you know the scandal?" "She wore the dress," Elena replied, remembering her art history classes. "The straps were too revealing. Society destroyed her for it." "They destroyed her for being beautiful in the wrong way," he corrected, "for refusing to diminish herself to make others comfortable. Sargent had to repaint it, add the strap to her shoulder, try to make her more acceptable. But the damage was done. She spent the rest of her life in obscurity." He paused. "I think about her sometimes, about how much of ourselves we're expected to change to earn acceptance." Elena felt something shift in her understanding of him. He wasn't just a man hiding behind a mask. He was someone who'd thought deeply about visibility and invisibility, about the cost of being seen and the cost of hiding. "What's your name?" she asked. "Your real name, not whatever nickname society has given you." He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then quietly he said, "Damien. Damien Ashford." "Damien," she repeated, tasting the name. "Thank you for telling me." "It's not a secret," he said. "People just prefer not to know. It's easier to avoid someone who doesn't have a name." They stood together in that quiet gallery, and Elena felt the weight of everything he wasn't saying. How many times had people looked past him? How many conversations had died when he approached? How many years had he spent being a ghost in his own life? Damien Ashford had not always been the scarred man. Once, nearly a decade ago, he'd been something else entirely. A prodigy, they'd called him. A genius. At 25, he'd already revolutionized architectural design, creating buildings that seemed to defy gravity, structures that merged classical beauty with modern innovation. His designs had won international awards. His firm had been courted by developers from Dubai to Singapore. He'd been engaged to a woman who graced magazine covers, invited to every exclusive event, considered one of the most eligible bachelors in high society. He'd been golden, untouchable, blessed by every advantage wealth and talent could provide. And then came the fire. It had been an accident, a freak occurrence during a site inspection of one of his buildings under construction. A gas leak no one had detected, a spark from a welder's torch, and suddenly the entire floor was an inferno. Damien had been trapped on the upper level, surrounded by flames, steel beams collapsing around him. He'd tried to shield his face, but the heat was too intense, the fire too hungry. By the time the firefighters pulled him out, his entire right side was destroyed. The burns had been catastrophic, 3rd and 4th degree, the kind that destroyed not just skin, but muscle and nerve. They'd kept him in the hospital for 8 months, surgery after surgery, skin grafts that never quite took, treatments that promised improvement, but delivered only incremental change. The pain had been indescribable, but worse than the physical agony was watching his life disintegrate around him. His fiancée had visited once, taken one look at his bandaged face, and never returned. She'd sent her assistant to deliver the engagement ring and a note that read simply, "I'm sorry, but I can't." His business partners had been more subtle, waiting until he was out of intensive care before suggesting he take a step back from the firm, perhaps work from home, maybe consider selling his shares. After all, clients wanted to meet the architect, and well, his appearance might make people uncomfortable. His friends had stopped calling. His family, wealthy and image-conscious, had offered to pay for any treatment, but had made it clear they preferred he remain out of the public eye. Don't attend the fundraiser. Perhaps skip the wedding. Maybe it would be better if you didn't come to Christmas this year, just until you're feeling more yourself. Except he would never be himself again. The doctors had been blunt about that. Even with the best plastic surgeons in the world, even with cutting-edge treatments, his face would never be normal. The right side was a landscape of scar tissue, raised and discolored, the skin pulled tight in places, drooping in others. His eye on that side functioned, barely, but the eyelid wouldn't close completely, giving him a perpetually startled expression. His mouth pulled to the right, making it difficult to speak clearly, making eating in public an exercise in humiliation. He was, in medical terms, disfigured, and in social terms, he was finished. So he'd chosen the mask, an ornate silver piece custom-made by a theatrical designer, beautiful in its own right, covering the worst of the damage while leaving his functional left side visible. It was a compromise, an attempt to exist in the world without forcing people to look at what made them uncomfortable. But it had only made things worse, because now he wasn't just the man with the burned face. He was the scarred man in the mask, a phantom, a curiosity, a cautionary tale whispered about at parties he attended, but was never truly part of. And yet, he kept coming, kept attending events, kept showing up to galas and fundraisers and museum openings. Not because he enjoyed them, not because he harbored any illusion that people wanted him there, but because the alternative was disappearing completely. Becoming invisible not just in society, but to himself. He'd built his life on creation, on leaving a mark on the world through his designs. If he let them erase him from social existence, what would be left? So he endured the stares, the whispers, the careful avoidance. He danced when forced to, stood alone when not, and told himself that visibility, even uncomfortable visibility, was better than vanishing entirely. Until a woman with kind eyes and trembling hands had danced with him, not because she wanted to, but because she'd been forced to, and somehow, in those few minutes, had made him feel like a person, rather than a problem. Standing in the gallery with her now, Damien found himself wanting to tell her everything. About the fire, the pain, the systematic dismantling of his entire life. About the loneliness that came not from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who wished you weren't there. About the strange liminal space he occupied, wealthy enough to attend these events, but marked enough to be unwelcome, visible enough to be noticed, but ignored enough to be invisible. But he said none of this, because opening doors, as he'd learned painfully, only invited more hurt. "Would you like to get coffee?" Elena asked suddenly, surprising them both. "I mean, not here. The coffee here is terrible. But there's a cafe around the corner, if you'd like, if you're not busy." Damien stared at her. "Why? Why would I want coffee?" she asked, deliberately misunderstanding. "Because I haven't had dinner, and I'm starving, and the canapes at these events are always tiny and terrible." "Why would you want to have coffee with me?" he clarified. Elena met his gaze steadily. "Because I like talking to you at the gala. Because I've been thinking about what you said about wounds, visible and invisible. Because you're the first person I've met at one of these events in months who said anything real." She paused. "And because I'd like to know more about Damien Ashford, not the scarred man Something cracked in his chest, a fissure in the armor he'd built so carefully. It would be safer to decline. Safer to maintain distance, to accept that their dance had been a fluke, a mandatory interaction that meant nothing. But he found himself nodding. "There's a cafe 2 blocks east. They have good coffee and better pastries, and tables in the back where it's quiet." Elena smiled, genuine and warm. "Perfect. Let me grab my coat." They left together, slipping out a side entrance to avoid the main event and the questions their departure together would raise. The November air was crisp, carrying the promise of winter, and their breath misted in the glow of streetlights. Damien was hyper-aware of the picture they made, him in his tailored suit and silver mask, her in an elegant black dress with a wool coat thrown over her shoulders. People on the street stared, of course. They always did. But with Elena beside him, talking about the Sargent portrait and arguing playfully that the scandal had been about more than beauty, about female autonomy and the male gaze, the stares bothered him less. The cafe was small, warm, lit by amber lights and smelling of fresh bread and dark roast coffee. The owner recognized Damien immediately and led them to a corner table near the back, partially screened by a bookshelf. It was the table Damien always sat at when he came here alone, which was often. They ordered. Coffee for him, black. Tea for her, with cream and honey. An assortment of pastries that arrived on a tiered stand. And then they talked. Really talked. In a way Damien hadn't talked to anyone in years. Elena asked about his work, and he found himself describing his architectural designs, the way he approached each building as a conversation between space and light, structure and emotion. She listened with genuine interest, asking intelligent questions, pushing back on some of his ideas in ways that made him reconsider his own assumptions. "So you haven't designed anything since the accident?" she asked, and he appreciated that she said, "accident, not fire, not incident, just a straightforward word with no pity attached." "No," he admitted. "I still own a share of the firm, but I'm not actively involved anymore." "Why not?" He gestured to the mask. "Would you want an architect who looks like this representing your $1 million project?" "If he was the best architect, yes," Elena said firmly. "And from what you've described, you are. Or were. Or could be again." Damien felt something unfamiliar, something that might have been hope, and immediately crushed it. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to disappointment. It's more complicated than that. "Everything is always more complicated than that," Elena replied. "It's a convenient excuse." He should have been offended. Instead, he found himself almost smiling. "You're very direct." "Life's too short to dance around things," she said, then laughed. No pun intended regarding the gala. They talked for 2 hours. The cafe emptied around them, other patrons coming and going. But they remained, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. He learned she was 28, had studied literature at Columbia, worked at a nonprofit focused on arts education for underprivileged children, that she'd grown up in the same society circles he had, expected to marry well and maintain the family reputation, but had quietly rebelled by pursuing work she found meaningful rather than advantageous. "My mother still hasn't forgiven me," Elena said, stirring her second cup of tea. She had a whole plan. Marry a suitable man by 25, have the first child by 27, settle into a life of charity luncheons and country clubs. Instead, I spend my days in public schools in Brooklyn, trying to convince 16-year-olds that Shakespeare matters. "Does he?" Damien asked. "Matter, I mean." "Of course," Elena said passionately. "Not because he's the pinnacle of human achievement, or whatever the academics claim, but because he wrote about being human, about love and betrayal and ambition and fear, about all the messy, complicated feelings we pretend don't exist in polite society. She paused. Like wearing masks, because showing our true face is too dangerous. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them acknowledged directly. When they finally left the cafe, the streets were quieter, the night deeper. Damien walked Elena to the corner where she could catch a cab, reluctant to let the evening end, but unsure how to extend it. "Thank you," he said. "For the coffee, for the conversation." "Thank you for showing me the sergeant," Elena replied, "and for being honest about why you come to these events, even when they are awful." She hesitated, then added, "Would you want to do this again? Coffee, I mean. Not a gala, not an obligation, just coffee and conversation." Every instinct Damien had developed over the past decade screamed at him to decline, to protect himself, to maintain the careful distance he'd constructed between himself and the possibility of rejection. But he looked at Elena's face, open and hopeful in the streetlight, and found himself saying, "I'd like that." They exchanged numbers. She hugged him goodbye, a brief, warm embrace that sent shock waves through his system because people didn't touch him voluntarily anymore. And then she was in a cab, waving through the window as it pulled away. Damien stood on the empty street corner for a long time after, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to reconcile this evening with everything he'd learned about how the world worked, about how people treated him, about what he could reasonably expect from human interaction. He couldn't. It didn't fit his carefully constructed understanding, which meant either he'd misread the situation entirely, or Elena Castellano was unlike anyone else he'd met. He wanted desperately to believe it was the latter, but experience had taught him to expect the former. Yet when his phone buzzed 3 days later with a text from Elena asking if he was free for coffee that weekend, Damien felt that dangerous thing again, that flutter of hope he'd learned to suppress. And this time, he didn't crush it. He let it live. They met on Saturday at a different cafe, this one in Greenwich Village, bohemian and crowded with artists and students, and people who cared more about the quality of the espresso than the appearance of their fellow patrons. It was the kind of place Damien rarely visited, because crowds meant stares, meant discomfort. But with Elena, navigating the packed space became almost bearable. They claimed a small table near the window and fell into conversation as easily as they had before. This time, Elena was the one who opened up. She told him about her father's death 5 years earlier, about how it had fractured her already strained relationship with her mother, about the pressure she felt to be perfect, to maintain appearances, to marry someone appropriate, even though she'd never met anyone who made her feel anything beyond mild interest or mild irritation. "It's exhausting," she admitted, cupping her hands around her coffee mug. "Performing all the time. Being the version of yourself other people need you to be." "Then why do it?" Damien asked. She looked at him, and he saw something raw in her expression. "Because it's easier than fighting. Because disappointing people is exhausting in a different way. Because I've spent 28 years being trained to be a certain kind of person, and I don't know how to be anyone else." Damien understood. He'd been that person once, the one who performed, who met expectations, who molded himself to fit the shape society demanded. The fire had stripped that option away. In its own terrible way, it had been freeing. "You know what I've learned?" he said carefully. "Being forced to stop performing, being stripped of the ability to hide behind social masks. It's awful. I won't pretend it's not. But it also means I can't lie anymore, not to others and not to myself. Everyone can see what I am. There's a strange kind of freedom in that." Elena was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I envy that. The honesty, I mean, not the circumstances." "The circumstances are what create the honesty," Damien replied. "You can't have one without the other." They continued meeting. Once a week became twice a week, became 3 times a week. Coffee turned into dinners at quiet restaurants, where Damien felt comfortable removing the mask long enough to eat, always positioned so his right side faced the wall. Museums and galleries became their common ground, places where they could walk and talk and examine beautiful things while discussing everything from philosophy to politics to their favorite childhood memories. Damien found himself looking forward to these meetings with an intensity that frightened him. Elena was unlike anyone he'd ever known. She was intelligent without being condescending, curious without being invasive, kind without being pitying. She laughed at his dry observations about high society, challenged his pessimistic worldview, and somehow made him feel like a person rather than a problem. But there was a line they never crossed, a boundary that remained firmly in place. They never discussed what they were to each other. Friends? Something more? Neither of them named it. And Damien never, not once, removed the mask in her presence. He couldn't, because as much as he was beginning to care for Elena, as much as these afternoons had become the bright spots in his otherwise isolated existence, he knew one fundamental truth. She had never seen his face. She had never looked at the full reality of what he was. And when she did, this fragile, precious thing they'd built would shatter. It always did. Damien had learned this lesson brutally with his ex-fiancée, with the friends who disappeared, with his own family. Affection lasted only as long as the horror remained hidden. Once people saw, really saw, they couldn't unsee, and they couldn't stay. But Elena seemed content with the boundary. She never asked about the mask, never pushed him to remove it, never even hinted that she wanted to see what lay beneath. For that, Damien was grateful and also perversely disappointed, because part of him wanted her to ask, wanted her to want to see, wanted her to be different from everyone else in every way, including this. It was a contradiction he couldn't resolve, wanting to hide and wanting to be seen, fearing revelation and longing for it. 3 months into their friendship, if that's what it was, Elena invited Damien to visit her nonprofit's after-school program. "We're doing a unit on architecture," she explained over coffee, having students design their dream buildings, learn about structural engineering, that kind of thing. "I thought maybe you could come talk to them, show them what's possible." Damien's immediate instinct was to refuse. Teenagers were cruel. He knew this from personal experience, the stares, the whispers, the barely contained disgust. But Elena was looking at him with such genuine enthusiasm, such faith, that he could contribute something meaningful, that he found himself agreeing. The school was in Brooklyn, a sprawling public building that had clearly seen better decades. Elena met him at the entrance, her face lighting up when she saw him in a way that made his chest ache. She led him through hallways covered in student artwork and motivational posters to a classroom filled with 20 teenagers who looked up with varying degrees of interest and suspicion when they entered. Damien saw the moment they noticed the mask, saw the eyes widen, the elbows nudging, the whispered questions. Saw one girl pull out her phone, probably to search for information or take a surreptitious photo. He'd learned to recognize these patterns, but Elena simply introduced him. "This is Damien Ashford. He's one of the best architects in New York, and he's going to talk to you about design." No apologies for his appearance. No nervous explanations. Just a straightforward introduction that treated him as exactly what he was, a professional with expertise to share. For the first few minutes, the students were distracted, focused more on his mask than his words. But Damien had prepared. He pulled up images of his designs on the classroom projector, buildings that seemed to float, structures that played with light and shadow, spaces that defied conventional thinking. And slowly, the students forgot about the mask. They leaned forward, asked questions, argued about whether form should follow function or function follow form. One boy, maybe 16, with paint-stained hands, asked, "How do you know when a design is finished?" Damien considered the question seriously. "You don't. A design is never finished. It's just due. At some point, you have to accept that perfection is impossible, and good enough is actually remarkable. You put your work into the world knowing it's flawed, knowing people will judge it, knowing it might fail. But you do it anyway, because the alternative is creating nothing." He saw Elena watching him from the back of the room, a strange expression on her face, and wondered what she was thinking. The session lasted 2 hours. By the end, the students were showing him their own designs, crude sketches and ambitious dreams, asking for feedback, debating with each other about materials and methods. When the bell rang and they reluctantly filed out, several stopped to thank him, one girl even taking a selfie with him, mask and all, like it was nothing remarkable. When they were alone, Elena approached with tears in her eyes. "What's wrong?" Damien asked, alarmed. "Nothing," she said, laughing and wiping her face. "That was just... You were amazing. Did you see their faces? You inspired them. You made them believe they could create something meaningful." "They did most of the work," Damien deflected. "No," Elena said firmly. "You did. You showed up, which is always the hardest part. And you shared your gift with them, even though I know being here, being stared at, was difficult." She took his hand, the gloved one, and held it between both of hers. "Thank you." Damien felt something shift in that moment, felt the careful walls he'd built begin to crack. Because Elena saw him, not the mask, not the tragedy, not the cautionary tale. She saw the person beneath, the creator, the man who still had value despite everything. And that was more dangerous than any physical intimacy could ever be. "There's a gala next month," he said before he could stop himself. "It's for the Architectural Preservation Society. I usually attend alone. Would you want to come with me? As my date?" Elena's eyes widened. "Your date?" "If that's presumptuous, I apologize," Damien started, but Elena squeezed his hand. "It's not presumptuous. I'd love to." They stood there in the empty classroom, hands linked, both acutely aware that something had changed between them, that they'd crossed some invisible line from friendship into something else, something unnamed but unmistakable. The night of the gala, Damien dressed with more care than usual. The same black tuxedo, perfectly tailored, but this time he added a tie pin that had been his grandfather's, a small detail that felt like armor. The mask gleamed after he'd polished it, the silver scrollwork catching the light. He looked at himself in the mirror, at the divided man who looked back, handsome and monstrous in equal measure, and wondered what Elena saw when she looked at him. He picked her up at her apartment in Greenwich Village, a small place filled with books and art, and the kind of comfortable disorder that suggested someone actually lived there rather than just staged it. She answered the door in a gown that made his breath catch, deep sapphire blue that brought out the gold in her hazel eyes, her dark hair cascading in loose waves over bare shoulders. "You're staring," she said, smiling. "I'm appreciating," he corrected. She blushed, and he realized he'd never seen her uncertain before. "Is it too much? My mother sent it. I think she's hoping I'll meet someone suitable tonight." "She might get her wish," Damien said, "though I doubt I'm what she has in mind." Elena's expression turned fierce. "You're exactly what I have in mind. Let's go before I say something that scares you away." The gala was at the Architectural Center, a modernist building of glass and steel that Damien had always admired. When they arrived, he felt the familiar dread, the anticipation of stares and whispers and careful avoidance. But this time, Elena's hand was in his, her presence beside him a shield and a declaration. They entered together, and yes, people noticed. Of course they did. But with Elena on his arm, radiant and confident, the narrative shifted. He wasn't the scarred man alone in the corner. He was part of a couple, and that simple fact changed everything. They moved through the crowd, and Elena proved herself adept at social navigation. She engaged people in conversation, drew Damien into discussions, made it clear through every subtle signal that he was with her, that anyone who wanted her attention would have to acknowledge him. It was protective without being obvious, supportive without being pitying. It was perfect. They danced, and this time there was no mandatory rotation, no obligation, just choice. Just the two of them moving together while everyone else faded into background noise. "I've been thinking," Elena said as they swayed to a slow melody, "about what you said that day in the museum. About wounds, visible and invisible." "What about it?" "I think I have invisible wounds," she admitted. "I think I've spent so long trying to be what everyone expects that I've lost touch with who I actually am. And that kind of wounding, it's insidious, because no one sees it. No one treats you differently. You just slowly disappear inside yourself until you're not sure there's anything left." Damien tightened his arm around her waist. "There's something left. I see it." "Do you?" she asked, searching his face. "Then tell me, who do you see when you look at me?" He thought carefully before answering. "I see someone who's brave enough to sit with discomfort instead of running from it. Someone who chooses kindness even when it's inconvenient. Someone who looks at the world and sees possibility instead of just problems. Someone who makes me believe I might be more than the sum of my scars." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Damien." "I'm not finished," he said. "I see someone who's been told her whole life that she's only valuable if she's ornamental, but who keeps choosing substance anyway. Someone who fights quietly but persistently for what matters. Someone who makes me want to create again, to build again, to be more than just a ghost in expensive clothes." "Stop," Elena whispered. "If you keep talking like that, I'm going to fall completely in love with you, and that will be very complicated." Damien's heart stopped. "Would that be so terrible?" "No," she said. "But it would be terrifying, because you matter, Damien. You've come to matter so much that the thought of losing you makes me want to hide. And I'm tired of hiding." "Then don't," he said. "Don't hide. Not from me." They stood in the middle of the dance floor, the music continuing around them, but neither of them moving, just holding each other, trying to process the weight of what had been said. Then someone bumped into them, breaking the moment, and they both laughed, slightly embarrassed. They left the dance floor and found a quiet corner, a small balcony overlooking the city lights. The November air was cold, but neither of them minded. "I need to tell you something," Damien said, the words coming before he'd fully decided to say them. "About the mask, about why I wear it." Elena turned to face him fully. "You don't have to." "I do," he insisted. "Because you deserve honesty. Because you've given me so much of yourself, and I've been holding back." He took a breath. "The fire happened 9 years ago. I was inspecting one of my buildings, and there was a gas leak. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The right side of my face, my neck, part of my shoulder, all burned. 3rd and 4th degree." Elena's hand found his, lacing their fingers together. "The physical recovery took over a year, but the social death was almost immediate. My fiancée left me while I was still in the hospital. My business partners pushed me out. My family, well, they still send birthday cards, but I haven't been invited to a family gathering in 8 years. I'm so sorry," Elena said. "I learned something in those years," Damien continued. "I learned that people can handle almost anything except discomfort. And visible difference, visible trauma, it makes people uncomfortable. So they avoid it. They avoid you. And slowly you become invisible. Not because you've hidden, but because everyone has decided not to see. He gestured to the mask. I wear this because it's a compromise. It acknowledges the damage without forcing people to look at it directly. It lets me exist in public spaces without causing too much disruption. But it also marks me, makes me the scarred man instead of just Damien. Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was steady but intense. I want to see you, without the mask. Damien felt ice flood his veins. No, why not? Because once you see, everything changes. I've lived this before, Elena. I've had people who cared about me, or said they did, look at my face without the mask and not be able to hide their reaction. The shock, the revulsion, the pity. He pulled his hand from hers. I can't watch you do that. I can't watch you see me and have everything we've built together collapse. You don't know that's what would happen, Elena argued. I do, he said firmly. Everyone says they can handle it until they can't. Everyone thinks they're different until they're not. And I care about you too much to watch you realize you can't bear to look at me. So what? Elena's voice rose, frustrated. We just continue like this forever? You hiding? Me pretending half your face doesn't exist? That's not a relationship, Damien. That's cowardice on both our parts. The word stung. I'm protecting us both. No, she said. You're protecting yourself. And I understand why. I do. But Damien, you can't build intimacy on barriers. You can't have real love while hiding. This is as real as I can offer, he said, and hated the defeat in his voice. Then maybe it's not enough, Elena said quietly. The words hung between them like a sentence. They stood in silence, both hurting, both wanting to reach out, but not knowing how to bridge the sudden chasm that had opened between them. Finally, Elena spoke. I'm not asking you to remove the mask right now. I'm not trying to force anything. But Damien, if we are going to be something real, something lasting, eventually you're going to have to trust me. You're going to have to believe that what I feel for you isn't conditional on you being easy to look at. It always is, he said bitterly. For everyone, it always is. No matter what they say. Then I guess you'll have to decide if I'm everyone or if I'm Elena. She picked up her purse from where she'd set it on the balcony railing. I should go. I need to think, and I think you do too. Damien wanted to stop her, wanted to take back everything he'd said, wanted to be different than he was, but he couldn't. So he just watched as she walked away, her blue gown disappearing into the Gala crowd, leaving him alone on the balcony, the city lights blurring as unexpected tears filled his eyes. He left shortly after, unable to bear the event without her. Drove home through empty streets, the city that never sleeps somehow feeling abandoned. In his apartment, a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, Damien stood in his bathroom and stared at himself in the mirror. He reached up slowly and unhooked the mask, lifting it away from his face. The right side looked back at him, a landscape of scar tissue and distorted features. The skin was shiny in places, puckered in others, discolored in shades of pink and white and brown. His eye on that side drooped, the eyelid damaged. His mouth pulled unnaturally to the right. His ear was partially gone, the cartilage melted away. He'd seen this face every day for 9 years. He knew every centimeter of damage, every place where his body had failed to heal properly, every reminder of the fire that had destroyed not just his face, but his entire life. And he couldn't imagine anyone, especially not someone as beautiful as Elena, looking at this and feeling anything but revulsion. 3 weeks passed. Damien didn't call Elena, and she didn't call him. The silence stretched between them like a physical thing, painful and vast. He threw himself into work, finally returning to his drafting table for the first time in years. If he couldn't have connection, he could at least have creation. He designed obsessively, building after building, each one more ambitious than the last. Structures that seemed to float, that defied gravity and expectation, that expressed everything he couldn't say out loud. It was during one of these late-night sessions, when he'd been working for 12 hours straight, that his phone rang. Not Elena. Worse. His mother. "Damien, darling," she said in her crisp, aristocratic voice. "I'm calling about the Winter Gala. You know, the one your father's firm is sponsoring." "I wasn't planning to attend," Damien replied, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Well, you should reconsider. It's important for the family. And I heard you've been seeing someone. Elena Castellano. Good family. You should bring her." The casual mention of Elena, the way his mother reduced her to good family, made something in Damien snap. "I'm not bringing anyone. I'm probably not coming at all. And Mother, when exactly did you stop seeing me as your son and start seeing me as a problem to be managed?" There was a long pause. Then, carefully, "Damien, that's not fair." "Isn't it? When was the last time you invited me to Sunday dinner? When was the last time you wanted to be seen in public with me? When was the last time you treated me like I was still part of this family instead of an embarrassment to be hidden?" "We've always supported you," his mother said, her voice tight. "We paid for every treatment, every surgery." "You paid to fix me," Damien corrected. "That's not the same as accepting me." He hung up before she could respond, sat in his studio, shaking with anger, and something deeper, something that felt like grief. Because his mother was right in one sense. They had paid for treatments. They had provided for him materially. But they'd also made it clear that their support was conditional. They would help him become presentable again. They would not help him learn to live as he was. Elena had been right. He was hiding. Not just from the world, but from himself. He'd spent 9 years wearing the mask, not just to protect others from discomfort, but to protect himself from having to fully accept what he'd become. As long as the mask stayed on, he could pretend part of him was still the old Damien, the golden boy, the prodigy. But the truth was, that person was gone, had been gone since the fire, and no amount of hiding would bring him back. Damien picked up his phone, stared at Elena's contact information, typed and deleted a dozen messages. Finally, he just wrote, "I'm sorry, you were right. Can we talk?" The response came immediately, as if she'd been waiting. "Yes. Tomorrow? The coffee shop in the village?" The next afternoon, Damien arrived early. Nervous in a way he hadn't been since he was a teenager. Elena walked in exactly on time, and his heart clenched at the sight of her. She looked tired, like maybe she hadn't been sleeping well, like maybe these 3 weeks had been as hard for her as they'd been for him. They ordered coffee, went through the familiar ritual, and sat at their usual table near the window. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Damien said, "I've been thinking about what you said, about trust, about building something real." Elena waited, her hands wrapped around her mug. "I've spent 9 years believing that my face defines me, that the damage is who I am, not just what happened to me. And I've structured my entire life around protecting people from having to see it, from having to react to it." He took a breath. "But what I was really doing was protecting myself from having to see their reactions, from having to know, definitively, that I'm unlovable like this." "Damien," Elena started, but he held up a hand. "Let me finish. Please. I need to say this." She nodded. "You scare me," he continued, "because you matter. Because for the first time in almost a decade, I've let someone in, and the thought of losing you is worse than the thought of being alone. So I've been trying to control the outcome, trying to keep the mask on, literally and figuratively, because as long as you don't see everything, there's still hope, still possibility. But that's not real, he said. It's a fantasy, and you deserve better. You deserve someone who's brave enough to be fully seen, even when it's terrifying. Elena's eyes were bright with unshed tears. What are you saying? I'm saying, Damien said, and his voice shook, that I want to show you. My face. All of it. Not because I think it'll be fine, not because I'm not absolutely terrified you'll look at me differently afterward, but because you're right. We can't build anything real on partial truths. Elena reached across the table and took his hand. Are you sure? No, he admitted, but I'm going to do it anyway. Not here, Elena said, looking around at the crowded cafe. Somewhere private. Somewhere you feel safe. They finished their coffee in silence, a different kind now, weighted with anticipation and fear. Then Elena said, Come to my apartment. We can talk there. Elena's apartment was exactly as he remembered it, cozy, cluttered in a lived-in way, filled with books and art and evidence of a life fully inhabited. She made tea, more for something to do with her hands than because either of them wanted it, and they sat on her worn couch, knees almost touching. Whenever you're ready, Elena said softly. No pressure. If you change your mind, that's okay too. But Damien knew if he didn't do it now, he might never. Might spend the rest of his life hiding. Might lose Elena to his own cowardice. Might remain suspended in this liminal space between visible and invisible forever. So he reached up with trembling hands and unhooked the mask. The silver piece came away from his face, and he set it carefully on the coffee table between them. Then, slowly, he turned to face Elena fully. Let her see everything. The scar tissue that covered the entire right side of his face, raised and discolored, and impossible to ignore. The way his eye drooped, the eyelid damaged beyond repair. The way his mouth pulled unnaturally to the right, distorting his expression. The melted cartilage where his ear should have been fully formed. The way the scarring extended down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. All of it. Every damaged inch, every reminder of the fire, every reason he'd hidden for 9 years. Elena looked, really looked, and Damien watched her face for the reaction he'd learned to expect. The initial shock, the inability to maintain eye contact, the carefully controlled expression that couldn't quite hide the discomfort. The slow realization that this was too much, that she couldn't handle it, that whatever feelings she'd had weren't strong enough to overcome this. But the reaction never came. Elena's expression changed, yes. Her eyes widened slightly as she took in the full extent of the damage. But she didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't let her gaze slide past the scarring to focus on his good side. She just looked at him, really looked, studying his face with the same careful attention she gave to paintings in museums. And then she did something no one had done since the fire. She reached out and touched him. Her fingers, gentle and warm, traced the line where scarred tissue met normal skin on his cheek, explored the texture of the damage without hesitation or disgust, moved along his jawline, across the distorted features, touching him as if he were something precious rather than something broken. Elena, he whispered, and his voice cracked. This is your face, she said simply. This is what you look like. And Damien, you're still beautiful. I'm not, he said automatically. You're being kind, but... I'm not being kind, she interrupted. I'm being honest. Do you look different than you did before? Yes. Is it shocking because I'm not used to seeing this? Yes. But beautiful isn't about symmetry or perfect features. It's about truth. And this, she touched his scarred cheek again. This is the truth of you. This is what you survived. And that survival, that strength, that refusal to disappear, that's beautiful. Tears were streaming down Damien's face now, both the normal side and the damaged side. Everyone else, he started. I'm not everyone else, Elena said fiercely. I'm me. And I'm telling you, Damien Ashford, that I see you. All of you. The brilliant architect, the wounded man, the person who taught my students about creating, despite fear. The friend who listened to me talk about invisible wounds. The man who makes me want to be braver. All of it. And I'm not going anywhere. She moved closer until they were inches apart. May I kiss you? She asked. Damien couldn't speak, could only nod. Elena leaned in and pressed her lips to his, gentle and careful and absolutely certain. She kissed the left side of his mouth, the normal side, and then, deliberately, she kissed the right side, the scarred side that pulled unnaturally. She kissed his cheek, the damaged one, pressing her lips to the scar tissue without hesitation. She kissed his temple, his jaw, his neck, where the scarring continued. And with each kiss, Damien felt something in him break open. All the walls he'd built, all the protection he'd wrapped around his heart, all the certainty that he was unlovable, it cracked and crumbled and finally shattered. When Elena pulled back, they were both crying. I love you, she said. I love you. And I'm not saying that despite your face, or because I'm heroically overlooking it. I'm saying it because of who you are, which includes this face, these scars, this survival. All of it. I love you too, Damien managed. I've loved you for months. I was just too afraid to admit it. They held each other on her couch as afternoon light faded into evening, as the city moved on outside her windows, as the world continued its indifferent rotation. But inside that small apartment, something had shifted. Something had healed. Not his face. That would always carry the marks of the fire. But something deeper. The wound that came from believing he was too damaged to be loved. The certainty that his appearance made him unworthy of connection. The fear that had defined every interaction for 9 years. Elena had looked at him fully, seen everything he'd been hiding, and stayed. More than stayed. Had touched him with tenderness, had called him beautiful, had loved him not in spite of his scars, but as a complete person whose scars were part of who he was. And for the first time since the fire, Damien believed he might be worthy of that love. They didn't leave Elena's apartment that night. They talked for hours, about everything and nothing, making up for the 3 weeks of silence. Damien told her about the fire in detail, about the hospital, about watching his life disintegrate piece by piece. Elena told him about her father's death, about the pressure from her mother, about the suffocating expectations that had shaped her entire existence. They ordered takeout, sharing noodles from the same container, and Damien realized it was the first time he'd eaten in front of someone, without the mask, without positioning himself strategically, without shame. Elena watched him without staring, acknowledged the difficulty of eating with a partially paralyzed mouth without making it a big deal, offered him extra napkins when he needed them without making him feel like a child. She treated it as what it was, a physical reality that required minor accommodation, not a tragedy that defined everything. Around midnight, Elena said, "Stay. Not for anything. Just stay. I don't want you to leave." So Damien stayed. They fell asleep on her couch, tangled together, Elena's head on his chest, his arms wrapped around her. He woke periodically through the night, disoriented, unused to sleeping anywhere but his own apartment, unused to sharing space with another person. But each time, Elena was there, solid and warm and real, and he'd drift back to sleep feeling safer than he had in years. In the morning, they had breakfast, coffee and toast and scrambled eggs. Mundane and perfect. Elena suggested they spend the day together, a real date, not hidden in quiet cafes or dark galleries, but out in the world. No mask? Damien asked, and she heard the fear in his voice. No mask, she confirmed, unless you want to. But Damien, I'd like to walk through the city with you. Really you. Not a performance, not a hiding. Just us. It was terrifying. It was also necessary. So Damien agreed. They walked through the village hand in hand. People stared. Of course they did. A man with extensive facial scarring drew attention. But with Elena beside him, confident and unapologetic, the stares bothered him less. She didn't shrink from the attention, didn't apologize for his appearance, didn't try to shield him. She just held his hand and talked to him like he was normal, because to her, he was. They went to a bookstore, browsing the shelves, Elena pulling books and reading him passages she thought he'd like. They had lunch at a small bistro, sitting at an outdoor table despite the cold, because Elena said the winter sun was too beautiful to waste. They visited the Guggenheim, walking the spiral ramp, discussing the paintings, existing in public as a couple. And slowly, Damien began to understand what Elena had been trying to tell him. That visibility didn't have to equal vulnerability. That being seen completely could be freeing rather than terrifying. That the world's opinion mattered less than the opinion of the person whose hand he was holding. That evening, back at Elena's apartment, she said, "I have something to ask you." "Anything," Damien replied. "The winter gala. Your mother mentioned it to my mother, who of course immediately called me to ask if we were attending together." Elena smiled wryly. "Our mothers have apparently been discussing us." "I'm sorry," Damien said automatically. "Don't be. But here's my question. Would you want to go? Together, officially, as a couple. You without the mask." Damien's chest tightened. That would be making a statement." "Yes," Elena agreed. "It would be saying that we're together, that you're not hiding, that anyone who has a problem with your face can deal with it, because I certainly don't." "People will talk," Damien warned. "People always talk," Elena countered. "But Damien, don't you see? Their talk, their opinions, their comfort, it doesn't matter. What matters is whether you're living your life or just surviving it. What matters is whether you're building something real or maintaining comfortable lies." She took his hands. "I want to be seen with you. I want the world to know we're together. I want to walk into that gala on your arm and dance with you and make it absolutely clear that I choose you. But only if you're ready. Only if you want that too." Damien thought about the years of hiding, the careful positioning, the strategic mask-wearing, the constant vigilance to minimize other people's discomfort. He thought about his mother's calls, his father's disappointed silence, his ex-fiancée's abandonment. He thought about all the ways he'd made himself smaller, quieter, less present to accommodate everyone else's inability to accept him. And then he thought about Elena, about her hand in his, about the way she'd touched his scars, about her declaration of love, about this past day walking through the city without shame, about the choice she was offering him, keep hiding or start living. "Yes," he said, "I want to go. With you. Without the mask." Elena's smile was brilliant. "Then let's show them exactly who we are." The winter gala arrived cold and clear, the kind of December evening where the city sparkled with holiday lights and possibility. Damien dressed carefully, Elena beside him in his apartment, the two of them helping each other with final touches. She wore a gown of deep crimson, her dark hair arranged in an elegant updo, her makeup subtle and perfect. He wore his best tuxedo, cufflinks that had been his grandfather's, his face bare of any covering. They stood together in front of his full-length mirror, and for the first time in 9 years, Damien saw himself as part of a pair rather than a solitary damaged thing. "Ready?" Elena asked, her hand finding his. "No," he admitted, "but let's go anyway." They arrived at the Plaza Hotel, where the gala was being held in its grand ballroom. The entrance was a parade of wealth and status, photographers capturing arrivals, guests being announced, the whole performative spectacle of high society. When their car pulled up, Damien felt the old panic rising, but Elena squeezed his hand, and he remembered. He wasn't doing this alone. They stepped out together. The photographer's cameras swiveled toward them, and Damien saw the moment they recognized him. Saw the confusion, the shock, the rapid-fire clicks as they captured image after image. Damien Ashford, the reclusive scarred architect, arriving without his mask, with Elena Castellano on his arm. It would be news. It would be gossip. It would be everything he'd spent years avoiding. And he didn't care. They walked into the hotel, heads high. The ballroom was stunning, all white and gold and glittering light. Hundreds of guests in their finest, the city's elite, gathered to see and be seen. When Damien and Elena entered, a ripple of attention moved through the crowd like a wave. People turned, stared, whispered. Damien saw his mother across the room, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Saw his former business partners, their expressions carefully neutral. Saw people he'd known for years, people who'd attended his engagement party before the fire, people who'd pretended he didn't exist afterward. And he saw the moment they all had to recalibrate. Because he wasn't alone. He wasn't the pitiful, scarred man hiding in the corner. He was half of a couple, with a beautiful, confident woman who clearly chose to be with him. Elena's presence changed the narrative, forced people to see him differently. They moved through the crowd, and Elena worked her social magic, engaging people in conversation, introducing Damien not as a curiosity, but as her partner. "This is Damien," she'd say warmly. "He's an architect. His designs are revolutionary." And people, confronted with her confidence, had to respond in kind, had to engage with him as a person rather than a problem. Damien's mother approached eventually, her expression complicated, a mixture of surprise and something that might have been pride. "Damien," she said carefully, "you look well. And Elena, lovely to see you." "Mother," Damien replied. There was a moment of awkward silence. Then his mother said quietly, "I'm glad you came. I'm glad you're here." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't acceptance of how she'd treated him. But it was something, a small opening. Damien nodded, and his mother moved on, and he realized he no longer needed her approval. Would accept it if it came, but didn't require it to feel whole. The evening continued. Dinner was served, and Damien ate without hiding, without strategic positioning, just existing in the space. Conversation flowed, and he found himself discussing architecture with interested parties, talking about his new designs, reconnecting with parts of himself he'd thought lost. And then came the dancing. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and Elena turned to him with a smile. "Remember the first time we danced?" she asked. "You were terrified and I was awful." "You were brave," Damien corrected. "We both were." They moved onto the dance floor, and this time people didn't give them a wide berth. Other couples danced nearby, the space feeling normal, inclusive, ordinary in the best way. Damien pulled Elena close, and they moved together with the ease of long practice, their steps synchronized, their bodies fitting perfectly. "I love you," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I love you for seeing me, for staying, for believing I was worth the risk." "You were always worth it," Elena replied. You just needed to believe it too. They danced through several songs, lost in each other, the rest of the world fading to background noise. When they finally left the dance floor, Damien realized something had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer the scarred man. He was just Damien. A person with a complicated history and visible trauma, and a brilliant mind and a capacity for love. All of it together, inseparable, undeniable. Later that night, standing on the balcony of his apartment, looking out over the city that had witnessed his fall and his slow, painful resurrection. Elena wrapped in his arms, Damien understood what he'd been searching for all these years. Not acceptance despite his appearance, not love that looked past his scars, but recognition of his complete humanity, scars included. Elena had given him that, had shown him that he didn't need to hide to be worthy of love. That vulnerability and visibility could coexist with safety and acceptance. That the right person wouldn't just tolerate his damaged face, but would see it as part of the story that made him who he was. "What are you thinking?" Elena asked, her head resting against his chest. "That I spent 9 years believing I was too damaged to deserve love," Damien said. "That I was wrong." "You were very wrong," Elena agreed. "But you figured it out. That's what matters." Damien kissed the top of her head, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. For years, he'd believed his face was a mask he couldn't remove, a barrier between him and genuine connection. But the real mask had been his fear, his certainty that no one could love him completely, his decision to hide rather than risk being fully seen. Elena had challenged that, had demanded honesty, had looked at every damaged part of him and said, "Yes, this too, all of it." And in doing so, she'd freed him from the prison of his own fear. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being seen but not recognized, from being visible but not valued, from being present but not accepted. Damien had lived in that loneliness for almost a decade, but no longer, because Elena had taught him that true acceptance doesn't look past your flaws or tolerate your differences. True acceptance sees everything you are, the beautiful and the broken and the complicated in between, and chooses you anyway. Not despite who you are, but because of who you are. Every scar, every wound, every piece of your story matters, not as something to be overcome, but as something that makes you uniquely, irreplaceably yourself. And when you find someone who understands that, who sees your complete truth and loves you for it rather than despite it, that's when healing really begins. Not the healing of wounds, but the healing of the belief that your wounds make you unworthy of love. Damien had been forced to dance with the scarred man in the mask once, at a gala where obligation demanded it. And in doing so, both of them had learned to see past the masks they wore, to find the truth beneath, to build something real from the ashes of everything they'd lost. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Comment where you're listening from. And if you felt it was really worth it, consider becoming a member to get early access to upcoming stories. And if you felt this story was really worth listening to, also click the super thanks button. Your gesture makes all the difference and helps us continue creating stories that touch the soul.